Hey everyone, welcome to the August 15th replacement lecture for International Relations at UCSD, summer 2019. This lecture is going to consider the possibility that actors are influenced by concerns other than money or security. You might call it spiritual, you might call it moral or cultural. The question is the same. Do decision makers respond to emotional cues? While we'll focus on second and third image explanations here, there's plenty of evidence that leaders make choices about war or how to conduct war based on moral concerns. Here we see evidence that Harry Truman decided to stop atomic bombing because he imagined what was happening to the victims. For this part of the lecture, our discussion of Cult of the Offensive, we're going to revisit World War I. Vannevar asks the same question Staussinger did. How did a relatively benign period of international relations descend into such violent chaos? Like Staussinger, Vannevar also declines to provide a lit review, and like Staussinger, he really only examines one case. We know that there's a problem or two with this setup, right? The first problem should be pretty obvious. If political science attempts to explain variation, it's sort of impossible to avoid the fact that there's no variation in the dependent variable here to explain. And there's no variation to explain it with either. We just have this single case. So Vannevar partly handles this by creating essentially a ghost case. The evidence from the offensive cult stacks up most strongly among Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia, who Vannevar argues are the architects of the war. These are the people that are really to blame. And then the evidence of a cult of the offensive stacks up least strongly among the responders: Great Britain, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, or Great Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. So this lets us know that the aggression, the seeds of the start of World War I, have everything to do with the cult of the offensive. We still aren't sure whether Vannevar controls for other explanations for the war. For example, Staussinger seems to suggest that paranoid leaders are the cause, and as we see, the leaders that seem to be the most paranoid correlates pretty closely with the places that Vannevar believes the cult was most offensive. Like Staussinger, Vannevar relies on evidence that exposes a direct linkage between offensive cults and the war. So let's see how his attempt stacks up against Staussinger's. Vannevar theorizes that military elites in the pre-World War I era had become socialized in an environment that told them that offensive capacity could win wars. As a result, these military leaders came to believe that quick offensive strikes could decisively end wars, or end them quickly. For Vannevar, this belief has 5 tangible effects that all made the world more dangerous and more likely to see war. The first is aggressive foreign policy. In order to be in the best position possible for a first strike, which was extremely important under the cult of the offensive's theology, states sought to maximize the territory and resources they controlled. As they all expanded, bumped around in the few places in the world that were not totally claimed, they increased the likelihood for war as each state saw any strategic gain by any other state as a threat. Second, militaries favored strategies that included preemptive strikes. Because states believed that defense was largely impotent against a large offensive strike, they were hypersensitive to moves toward a first strike, which could only be countered by moving even faster. So if you sense that your rival is moving their troops toward the border and you don't know what they're doing, the only rational response is to move your troops more quickly to your border, which your rival sees as an ambiguous signal that you might be preparing for war, and the only rational response to that is to move their troops more quickly to their border. So as a result, we sort of get this cascading paranoia. States were also anxious that whatever offensive advantage they gained might be eroded in the future. If you think that you're ahead and you're liable to fall behind, then you need to strike while the iron is hot rather than falling behind to defend against the attack of a superior power. This piece of logic has some similarities to the power transition theory that we looked at in the week where we discussed structures and realism, right? If you think that you're the top power now and that you won't be the top power for very much longer, you want to strike while the window of opportunity is open. Fourth, we have competitive diplomacy. Vannevar also believes that cults of the offensive will encourage states to view diplomacy differently than those places that don't have cults of the offensive. Rather than seek a consensus through negotiation, diplomacy became about threats and bluffing and brinkmanship, all of which make a miscalculation that leads to a first strike and therefore war more likely. And then lastly, there's a focus on secrecy. Because first offensive strikes are easier to effect when the other side doesn't know they're coming and therefore can't swing in for their own first strike, states make military moves in greater secrecy, which of course tends to make their rivals nervous. Is a first strike coming? What's Belgium doing over there? So when we think about all of these things in combination, we can see how we've created sort of a paranoid strike first culture here, a theory of a paranoid strike first culture. These secret, furtive movements might look like preemptive strikes and cause states to believe that maybe their windows of opportunity are closing or that they've misappraised the distribution of geopolitical power and that therefore they need to strike even faster. So recall that in Vannevar's theory, the cult of the offensive, the presence of the cult of the offensive, which we'll define in a little bit, is the immediate independent variable. And so what we're looking for here is whether a country has a yes in the offensive cult column, right? We can assess every single country for whether or not there's a cult of the offensive in that country and populate that country with a yes or no answer. According to Vannevar, if the value of the cult of the offensive variable is yes, then we see these state behaviors as a consequence, and then ultimately, these behaviors lead to war between states that view each other suspiciously because ultimately the cult of the offensive drove this behavior. Let's look at the evidence of each relationship in turn. The independent variable asks whether there is a cult-like worship of offensive capacity. So how might we measure this? Well, Vannevar provides a number of direct quotes from the memoirs of military officials and their war and policy plans. Here are some examples from Germany. Notice von Schlieffen is saying attack is the best defense. The offensive mode of action is far superior to the defensive mode. So we're seeing some direct evidence that people in Germany in particular actually believed these things. Here's from France. France was obsessed with the virtues of the offensive and no longer knows any law other than the offensive. Britain and Russia, even Belgium seem to believe in offensive capacity to some extent. These beliefs led to concrete predictions about the war itself. In 2 weeks we shall defeat France and then we will turn around and defeat the Russians, reestablish order in the Balkans. There's no nervousness that they could possibly lose because the Germans are going to strike first. Now, at this point, you might be saying to yourself that a lot of these logics sound like realism. These states are obsessed with their own survival. And that's true. So why does this count as a political sociological theory instead of a realist theory? Well, the answer is sort of in the title here, right? This isn't a school of the offensive. It isn't a way of thinking that turns out to be true. It's a cult of the offensive. And it's hard to overstate how horribly, comically, tragically wrong this view was. The vast majority of battle deaths in World War I happened as wave after wave of men climbed out of their trenches and got mowed down by fortified machine guns. Those that survived long enough usually got stuck in the barbed wire fortifying the opposite bunker and were then bayoneted to death or killed with nerve gas. World War I was such a defensive war that a huge portion of the casualties died just from sitting around in muddy trenches. Once they were established, the battle lines in World War I, particularly on the Western Front, barely ever moved. So part of the reason we think that this is sociological is that the elites who are making these decisions have essentially been inculcated toward believing that offense is the best strategy, and it turns out that they're wrong. So it's the political military culture among the military elite that really matters here. That's where the variation is. It's not in some sort of realist calculation, but in a mistaken belief about what's good strategy. So did a belief in the cult of the offensive seem to produce the predicted behaviors, and did those behaviors lead to war? Germany appears to have adopted policies consistent with Vanneva's expectations. Here, the Germans are concerned. If Germany does not rule the world, it will disappear from the map. We need colonial possessions to make sure that Germany is safe. As did Russia. Notice that the policy here in the Balkans refers specifically to a region in which the war eventually breaks out. We need to dominate an area with our influence that's strategically important for us. We should also see evidence that aggressor states favored preemptive strikes. Defense was so disrespected that a matter of days was believed to make the difference. Every day was of far-reaching importance. Any delay might leave the Austrian forces open to being struck by the full weight of the Russian offensive. We need to move very fast. Once the German preparations began, it would cost France 10 to 12 miles of territory for each day of delay. That's how quickly the Germans could run through and establish fortified positions that the French would never move. The Russians were concerned that they wouldn't even be able to detect a German mobilization in time to provide any sort of defense for themselves. The Germans were sort of reciprocally concerned that they wouldn't be able to detect the Russian mobilization. The French felt the same way. Worrying about a mobilization in secret, information from excellent sources leads us to fear that there's a secret mobilization taking place in Germany. We're very worried about these preemptive strikes. And in fact, all parties tend to keep their first strikes a secret. Notice that these pieces of evidence also show us the importance of secrecy. So we're kind of seeing already how the pieces of Vanneva's mechanism are working together to collude toward creating a war in Europe. We should also see evidence that aggressor states worried about windows of opportunity. Germany worried that Russia would overtake it. She will crush us by the number of her soldiers, right? They're coming. They thought that they might be better off attacking in order to manage this problem. The big Russian railway under construction are perhaps preparations for a great war. Maybe if we attack now, before that railway is in place, we'll be able to stop Russia from rising. So again, there's a lot of the sort of realist critique of transition of power baked into this. But for Vannevera, this is a belief cult, and it turns out to be a cult in a belief that is really, really wrong. Austro-Hungary makes the same sort of a case here. It would be better to go to war immediately rather than at some later period. We can talk about competitive diplomacy or a focus on secrecy, but let's not. It's probably not a great use of time to go over ever more selections from the reading. And we've sort of already talked about secrecy anyway. But what you should take from this exercise and looking through these slides is how you can pick out portions of the reading that appear to be consistent with the theory that's been set out. That sort of critical reading, the ability to identify this evidence, will be very good not only in your future as political scientist, but also once you are on the job market and you're being asked to look for these sorts of consistent things in trends in the businesses that you work for. Where would we put Vannevera's theory then? We're talking about differences in military institutions in each country, so we probably call this a second image theory. There are differences within the units that matter most. Does this unit have a cult of the offensive, or is that cult absence? Vannevera focuses on the culture of the military, so I'd argue that this is a sociological model. Obviously, that's where I put it in the organization of the class. But the military does care about survival, so if you were to write this up as a realist theory, that would probably be worth a fair number of points. Okay, so Vannevera explains to us how culture might work to change elite opinions, Now we're going to transition to a different theory, Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which posits something different. It posits that culture, rather than being the key to how we consider war and peace and how we frame up whether other countries are threats, Huntington makes the argument that the differences in our culture actually make us incompatible as societies at peace. Huntington's main and famous argument is that new wars will focus predominantly on civilizational struggle. Nation-states will still be the main actors, but Huntington argues that war was never really about states or their realist interests in the first place. He goes through a number of historical reasons for war to demonstrate that this is true. In the beginning of European history, wars were fought for the royal property of kings. Kings like Henry V fought to take over territory more or less to fill their own coffers. After that, we saw both internal and external wars that were fought to defend democracy against royalism. So now we have a series of wars to remove the king. Then we had wars about fascism, wars to protect democracy against the spread of fascist ideals, and then wars to protect capitalism against the spread of communist ideals. And then finally, we've reached the modern era, in which we have wars about civilizations. At this point, Huntington argues that World War activity has been disproportionately European, but now the age of Western-centered conflict is over. Weird, of course, that we would ignore all of the Chinese and Arab wars that happened during this time, but we're just out of view of our sort of high school European history. But, we save that critique of Huntington for another day, I guess. It's important to note that for Huntington, culture aggregates. Villages are different than one another. Villages have different cultures from one another. Regions have different cultures from one another, and countries have different cultures from one another. As we expand further and further out, we find that civilizations have different cultures from one another. This creates a bit of a problem for Huntington. Why should the civilization be the unit of conflict instead of the village, or instead of the region, or instead of the country? Well, Huntington makes an argument for why this should be true. The first is that civilizational communities feature ancient differences. These are deep-seated, and they affect self-identities, the way that we think about ourselves and the way that we think about what we value. What are these differences? Huntington cites language, tradition, and especially religion as being sets of ancient differences that convince us that we are incompatible with people who exist in other civilizations. Second, and historically, people bounded into certain geographic territories traded together and worked together more often. Natural communities emerged with related languages and traditions and religions, so the distance that we need to go to meet someone in a cultural middle ground is much smaller within civilizations than without it. The village down the street may have a different culture, but those cultural differences are relatively mild compared to the cultural differences between a village in Italy and a village in China. This is particularly true of trade, and there are efficiency gains that remain here. For example, Huntington argues that Hong Kong and Taiwan are going to forge deeper ties with China because doing business there will be easier for firms in Hong Kong and Taiwan to begin with. This is because Hong Kong and Taiwan share traditional language relationships, cultural values, and even though religion is not particularly well respected in China, even similar religions. Yet globalization threatens these identities as Huntington sees it. Traditional elites feel their influence waning, and they want to preserve it. Traditional elites fight against the fact that the soft power export of Western culture, or the gaining of materialist values as global commerce opens up, are all eroding the ability of their cultural institutions to maintain control and deliver them wealth and power. This is especially true because Western states are exporting culture disproportionately, and they undermine what might make economic growth unique within each civilization. So if you imagine that, um, the Chinese civilizations or the Orthodox civilizations were left to their own devices without any Western culture, that they might come to civilizational solutions, how to manage the problem of globalization that respected their local traditions. But that's not happening because of the Western incursion on culture. Lastly, it's really easy to identify people based on their civilization. So if you need an outgroup to punish, it's pretty easy to choose one, right? You pick people who don't look like you, who don't worship like you, who have different values than you. And these differences, Huntington argues, are manifest in our daily relationships with one another. So it's convenient. It's much, much harder for a German to tell an Austrian apart from their own people than it is for a German to tell a Nigerian apart from their own people. And so for this reason, we reach for the easiest grouping of cultural dissimilarities, ones that correlate with race or with really broad religious behaviors that are super easy to identify. If you're not going to church on a Sunday and instead you're bowing in the direction of Mecca on Fridays, we know that you're a Muslim and not a Christian. So Huntington predicts two different types of conflict will emerge from these civilizational clashes. The first is a micro sort of conflict. In the micro conflict, we have these hyperlocal groups that attempt to capture bits of territory from those they consider to be others, or maybe to ethnically cleanse certain areas of people who belong to a different civilization in their view. And then, of course, we also have the macro level of conflict. And in these conflicts, what we see is that some leading nation state serves as the flag bearer for a civilization, and all of the minor countries of that civilization rally around them so that the international war reflects civilizational borders, as well as the more micro conflicts along the fault lines between civilizations. Another analyst considers that there might be three levels among representative states, within fault line states, or between fault line states, and internal to fault line states. So we might see wars in addition to whole civilizational wars and in addition to civil wars within states that have more than one civilization. We might also see minor states along the fault lines fight with each other. Most of Huntington's own evidence relies on vignettes. For example, the Balkans and Central Asia seem to feature a lot of violence between European Christendom, Orthodox Christianity, and Islamic civilizations. Has this new Cold War come to pass? Things are bad now, but weren't before, so... He also makes a prediction about cultural animosity between Japan and the United States. Has this come to pass? And, of course, the most important fault line, Islam. Huntington notes that the first Gulf War pitted a coalition of Western states against some Arab countries. But there's something weird about this, right? The conflict starts between two Arab states, right? And so whether or not this is a civilizational conflict, it doesn't seem to make as much sense as some of his other examples. Also, we see that Jordan is presently an ally of the United States. Is this temporary because the U.S. is so powerful? Will all Arab states have to choose a more powerful patron from another civilization because there's no central Arab state that could stand up to the United States or to Russia? So we're sort of left wondering what the main country inside the Islamic civilization is going to be if Huntington is right. Many commentators often boil down Huntington's thesis to this. Is this cultural necessarily? If the patterns we observe is really that the West, some group of North American, Western European, and British-descended settler countries like Australia and New Zealand are all fighting against the rest of the world, is this about culture? Is there something else that varies here? Maybe these are fights between the developed and the non-developed world. Other papers have attempted to test Huntington's thesis a little bit more carefully than Huntington did. For example, Norris and Engelhardt took this out of Huntington's predictions. The West and Islam should clash over political values. This was Huntington's prediction in the Clash of Civilizations argument. So what we should be able to do then is compare attitudes about democracy. If it's true that Islamic civilization is simply disrespectful of democracy, then we should be able to do a means difference test. We should be able to gather average attitudes towards democracy in Islamic and Christian countries and see that Christian countries respect democracy more, or citizens of Christian countries respect democracy more than citizens of Muslim countries do. So this is what they head out to do. They compare attitudes toward three dimensions of political and social values, in particular support for democratic ideals, attitudes towards political leadership, and approval of gender equality. The results in Norris and Engelhardt show that, contrary to Huntington's thesis, support for democracy is actually stronger among people who live in Islamic societies. And so Huntington's theory that Islam would come into conflict with the Christian West because Islam does not respect democracy takes a hit here, right? If that were true, it should be the opposite. Western societies should have more support for democracy than Islamic societies do. But as it happens, most Muslims recognize that they are living in places that are semi-authoritarian, and they yearn for democracy. They might not yearn for America to bring it to them, but they yearn for democracy. And in the United States and other places in the West, we maybe take democracy for granted. Fox looks at internal struggles in states that are on the border of civilization, states that are maybe cut in half in Samuel Huntington's map of civilizations. He makes the prediction that if Huntington is right, the majority of ethnic conflicts that we see should be between civilizations rather than within civilizations. He also surmises that the majority of conflicts should be between the West and Islam, or between the West and China. And then lastly, he predicts that the number of civilizational conflicts should be higher since the Cold War has ended. In order to test these theories, Fox uses data about minorities that are at special risk of abuse because of the percentage of the country that they make up, and looks for conflicts in and among countries that have minorities that are at risk. Let's see what he found. Well, civilizational conflicts, for starters, are not in the majority, and they have not become more common, right? In the Cold War era, civilizational conflicts, or conflicts between two ethnic groups from different civilizations, made up 36.9%. Today, they make up 37.8%, so they've actually become less common. Non-civilizational conflicts, that is, conflicts that happen between ethnic groups that are part of the same civilization, still make up the vast majority of ethnic conflicts. Now, why would that be the case? Well, it's probably convenience, right? If you live close to other people that are part of your civilization, you're more likely to fight with them. And so you might say that somehow this is not indicative of Huntington's thesis. But Huntington did pretty clearly predict that in the post-Cold War era, we should see growth in civilizational conflicts. And again, in fact, we see the opposite. The number of civilizational conflicts has decreased. Here we test a different theory. The borders of Islam are violent. There are a lot of conflicts between Islamic societies and societies of the West, Slavic or Orthodox societies, and Chinese societies. But that being said, the vast majority of clashes occur within Islamic civilization and within African civilization. And so again, we're left with evidence that by far the most common sorts of clashes occur between ethnicities that are part of the same civilization, which is the opposite of what Huntington predicted. There should be a sort of rallying around the civilizational flag that leads to greater cooperation within a civilization and greater conflict outside of it. Finally, there's no difference between civilizational and non-civilizational conflicts with respect to how intense they become. And there's no difference in the amount or intensity of these conflicts in the pre and post Cold War. So Huntington creates this theory that we're going to rally around civilizational values, that this represents the next frontier in wars. After we've seen wars to defend democracy against fascism and capitalism against communism, we should see wars that are about civilizational cultural values. But in fact, the papers that have looked into this question show very little support for it. Okay, well, this sort of ends our tour of the different types of conflict theories and international conflict, and how these assumptions in international relations break down, how conflicts start. Next week, we're going to take a look at modern problems in international public policy, public security policy. In particular, we're going to look at how American foreign policy should deal with the problems posed by a rising China, and then we will take a short look at nuclear security, and in particular, how the United States is negotiating differently between North Korea and Iran. I will see you next week.